Unaccountable and unelected international organizations have an uncanny amount of influence over our daily lives with their so-called regulatory recommendations, which are often implemented globally. Just recently, an international organization consisting of most of the world's securities regulators published their so-called recommendations about how DeFi should be regulated. Today, we're going to summarize these recommendations and tell you what they could mean for the crypto market. Spoiler alert, they were crafted under the leadership of the SEC. It's safe to say that this is a video you do not want to miss. The report we'll be summarizing today is titled, quote, Final Report with Policy Recommendations for Decentralized Finance. It was published by the International Organization of Securities Commissions, or IOSCO, late last year, and we'll leave a link to the full document in the description if you're interested. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, this particular report was put together under the supervision of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC. For those who've been living under a rock, the SEC has been going after the crypto industry ever since Gary Gensler, a former Goldman Sachs banker, became its head in early 2021. If you've watched any of our videos about other unaccountable and unelected international organizations, such as the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, you'll know that they all seem to be closely affiliated with the United States, and their so-called recommendations almost always become regulations around the world. Now, in case you're wondering why I keep using finger quotes, that's because these recommendations are not recommendations. They are requirements. The countries that fail to comply with these recommendations often find themselves in trouble with the US and its allies. Now, naturally, almost nobody reads the reports that these unaccountable and unelected international organizations release, especially when it comes to niche topics like crypto. This is unfortunate because reading these reports can, and often does, give you a sense of what's coming to your country. That's why IOSCO's DeFi recommendations are so important. These recommendations could become regulations in the not-so-distant future. As with all recommendations, IOSCO has created a list of 9 for DeFi that it wishes to see implemented as regulations around the world. We'll break down what each of these recommendations are and what practical effect they could have on the crypto market in just a moment. First, though, we need to unpack what the authors say about DeFi in their report to get a better sense of where they're coming from and why their recommendations are wrong. And by the way, if you're enjoying the video so far, please do smash that like button to give it a boost. Now, the report begins with a brief summary, wherein the authors explain what DeFi is. For those unfamiliar, DeFi is a crypto niche that consists of decentralized applications that provide products and services you'd normally find in the traditional financial system, such as borrowing, lending, and saving. The difference, of course, is that DeFi is completely peer-to-peer. There are no intermediaries, and that means there are no restrictions on who can use its protocols. In practical terms, that means no KYC, no limits on trading, on borrowing, on saving, on lending, etc. Now, obviously, that is big competition for banks. To be fair, though, the relatively unregulated nature of DeFi means that it does come with its fair share of risks – hacks, exploits, scams, rug pulls, you name it. In other words, there is next to no investor protection, and if you know anything about regulators like the SEC, you'll know they're all about investor protection, at least in theory. In reality, regulators like the SEC often use the excuse of investor protection to limit regular people's access to certain financial products and services. While DeFi certainly does have its faults, what the SEC and other such regulators are calling for would effectively turn it into another arm of the existing financial system. Logically, this requires global coordination to ensure there's no place that truly free and open financial services can be accessed. This is stated by the authors in the summary, though with much nicer wording, of course. Quote, promote greater consistency with respect to the regulation and oversight of crypto markets. And on that note, if you've been keeping up with our coverage of crypto regulation, then you'll know there's one quote that almost every single one of these reports includes. Same risk, same regulation. It's a principle which, as I just noted, justifies regulating crypto the same as TradFi, turning them into the same thing. As a fun fact, this principle appears to have its roots in the World Economic Forum, or WEF, another unelected and unaccountable international organization that's been surprisingly open about how it wants to control every aspect of our lives. More about the WEF in the description. I digress. Hold up a second there, Guy. Sorry to interrupt, folks, but I just wanted to very quickly tell you about the Coin Bureau deals page. Now, this is the place where we have put together some of the very best deals and promos in all of crypto. So you can think things like exchange sign-up bonuses, trading fee discounts, and money off of hardware wallets, and much, much more besides. So if you want to check that out, coinbureau.com/deals is the place to go, or you can just use the link in the description of this video down below. Thanks very much, and now back to you, Guy. Now, in the first part of the report, the authors give a bit of background about IOSCO's DeFi regulations. Not surprisingly, they've been working on these for a while, since March 2022 to be exact. This is to be expected given that DeFi saw explosive growth during the crypto bull market in 2021. Incredibly, the authors reveal the real reason why they want to crack down on DeFi. One of the reasons why they want global DeFi regulations is, quote, to facilitate a level playing field between crypto asset markets and traditional financial markets. Remember what I said about banks and competition. What's interesting is that the authors use a fairly childish framework of why, what, who, and how in crafting these DeFi recommendations. By now, you'll know the why. DeFi presents significant risks to investors and the markets. That is, they are a risk to established financial institutions and their cronies. The what is pretty self-explanatory. Borrowing and lending protocols, decentralized exchanges, probably also liquid staking protocols. As we've seen, it's possible that some regulators will even go after stablecoins. Again, anything that's seen as a threat to the established institutions must be eliminated or absorbed. Anyways, the who side is where things get concerning. As we've seen with the crackdown on Tornado Cash, regulators around the world are starting to target individual crypto developers, not just companies. In the report, the authors call for identifying the, quote, regulatory touchpoints of DeFi protocols. Translation, crack down on any key players you can identify. And finally, we have the how, which is all about how to turn these recommendations into regulations. And then these unaccountable and unelected international organizations will turn around and tell you that these are nothing more than recommendations. You'll recall that these recommendations are basically binding. Now, in the second part of the report, the authors give a bit of background about the DeFi niche. They start with an arguably false proclamation. Quote, a common misperception is that DeFi products and services are materially different from those found in traditional financial markets. As always, they're playing around with definitions. Depending on your definition of, quote, materially different, then this statement could be true. We would argue, though, that the fact that all transactions in DeFi occur peer-to-peer without an intermediary makes them materially different. As expected, the authors gloss over this fact and instead focus on the fact that it was humans that wrote the code for these DeFi protocols, and because humans are involved, government regulations must necessarily follow. Ladies and gentlemen, the pinnacle of statist thinking. Anyhow, jokes aside, after some short explanations of the most popular types of DeFi protocols, DEXs, lending and borrowing protocols, and aggregators, the authors provide their, quote, enterprise-level viewpoint. They seem to argue that all of DeFi is inherently connected to larger corporate structures. To be fair, a lot of DeFi protocols do have private companies and non-profit foundations that build and maintain their back-ends and front-ends. However, most DeFi protocols are purposely designed such that even if you were to wipe these entities off the face of the earth, they would continue to operate as is. The authors also include DAO token holders as part of their enterprise-level viewpoint. For reference, most DeFi protocols are governed by decentralized autonomous organizations, essentially decentralized communities where all changes are voted on by those who hold the governance tokens of the protocol. Now, this is more significant than you think because it foreshadows a scenario where regulators start to target the holders of these governance tokens, at least the whales. To put things into perspective, fewer than 1% of DAO token holders hold 90% of the voting power, according to a report from the summer of 2022. Now, if you thought that was crazy, the authors appear to include miners and validators as part of their enterprise-level viewpoint too. They specifically note, quote, service providers, oracles, bridges, and miners/validators as stakeholders in DeFi protocols, who could apparently be held accountable. If this sounds familiar, that's because an anti-crypto politician in the United States named Elizabeth Warren is in the process of trying to push through a bill which would do exactly that and more. It would require all participants in crypto to conduct KYC on all users and interactions, even with crypto wallets. Heck, even IOSCO doesn't go after the wallets. Then, following a recap of Terra's collapse, USDC's depegging, and all the illicit financial activity that's allegedly being done via DeFi, the authors tacitly admit that securities regulators around the world don't have the expertise to address this crypto niche and don't think they can get enough quality data to do it properly. Make no mistake, though, that won't stop them from trying. And this brings us to the third part of the report, which is where those 9 DeFi recommendations come into play. The authors start by saying that, quote, IOSCO is issuing these policy recommendations to help IOSCO members apply relevant existing IOSCO standards through their own regulatory frameworks, as appropriate, to DeFi products, services, activities, and arrangements within their jurisdictions. Note that IOSCO's members include almost every securities regulator in the world. Notably, these authors note that these recommendations should be factored into existing DeFi regulations in countries where they already exist. So, if you think you're safe because you're doing DeFi in a country with good DeFi regulations, think again. Chances are those regulations will change fairly soon. For securities regulations specifically, the authors instruct regulators to look for anything that could be classified as a securities offering, not just governance tokens. If you watched our video about the SEC's lawsuit against Coinbase, you'll know that it considers staking to be a securities offering. Let that sink in. And last but not least, the authors instruct regulators to be on the lookout for any individuals and institutions that could be held accountable for operating a DeFi product or service. I'll remind you that this could very well include the likes of oracles, bridges, miners, and validators. Truly terrifying stuff. So, this relates to the first recommendation, and that's to analyze DeFi products and services to assess what the appropriate regulatory response should be, or can be, given the arrangement. The authors say that regulators should look at where key individuals and institutions are based to assess what's appropriate. Then, regulators ought to look at these DeFi protocols through the aforementioned enterprise-level viewpoint, which includes the scrutiny of miners and validators and all of that. And here they go one step further by telling regulators to try and dig deep to the technical level of the blockchain, if possible. As a not-so-fun fact, the EU's recently passed Data Act contains a provision that could theoretically require all smart contracts to include a kill switch. How much do you want to bet that this will be applied to DeFi protocols to ensure compliance with these so-called recommendations? Anyhow, speculation aside, the second recommendation follows from the first, and that's to identify responsible persons, which includes companies, by the way. If you're wondering what that means, the authors say it's anyone who has, quote, sufficient influence over a DeFi protocol. More definition shenanigans. What's scary is that the authors throw the concept of decentralization out of the window. They say that no matter how decentralized a DeFi protocol is, quote, there is usually a responsible person or persons that controls or sufficiently influences the offer of products, provision of services, or engagement in activities. A modern-day witch hunt, if you will. As a cherry on top, the authors point the finger at DAOs as entities that could potentially be held accountable, and seem to imply that this is the case regardless of how the governance token distribution looks like. This provision could open the door to regulators going after regular DeFi DAO participants. The authors then provide a list of potentially accountable entities, which you can see here. As you can see, it explicitly mentions DAOs, or participants in DAOs, in addition to founders, those with the keys to the smart contracts of the DeFi protocols, and apparently even DAO governance token holders. Yikes. The nightmare continues with the third recommendation, which is to standardize DeFi regulations at a global level. As you might have guessed, the authors spend multiple paragraphs explaining why every single country around the world must fall into line and turn these recommendations into regulations. Investor protection, market integrity, DeFi connections to TradFi, DeFi intermediaries, wherein the authors imply that all DeFi protocols are intermediaries. The list goes on. It consists of the insanity you might expect and ends with a note that cryptocurrencies themselves could be guilty of violating the regulations. Seriously. Quote, Layer 1 blockchains could themselves be carrying out clearing and settlement activities. This ties into the fourth recommendation, which is to require identification and identify conflicts of interest. What's fascinating is that the authors make no mention of KYC to use DeFi. Rather, they call on regulators to force responsible persons to identify themselves and their conflicts of interest. This is fascinating because it could be evidence of the fact that regulators around the world know that they would never succeed in getting DeFi protocols to enforce KYC until they've actually identified the people who could implement such a requirement. For some DeFi protocols, this will never be possible. That said, the authors do include a footnote which references the FATF's KYC and AML recommendations. If you've watched any of our videos about the FATF's recommendations, you'll know that their endgame is to make any truly crypto activity, such as DeFi, illegal by labeling it as high risk. Oddly enough, the fifth recommendation continues the theme of going after responsible persons. This time, it calls for identification of plus the addressing of risks, including technological and operational risks. The provisions of this recommendation are predictable, but their scope is unprecedented. For example, it includes scrutiny of minor or maximal extractable value, aka MEV, wherein miners and validators have the ability to rearrange transactions in blocks to their benefit. It also includes oracles and bridges, as well as smart contract audits, but that's pretty standard stuff, even in the crypto industry. Lo and behold, recommendation 6 is about responsible persons too. It requires them to provide clear, complete, and accurate disclosures. This is pretty standard stuff from a securities law perspective. Relevant products and services have to provide this information, and it's honestly not a bad thing. The thing is that these disclosures are often independently verifiable in the case of DeFi. That is, anyone can check to see what's going on in DeFi using a blockchain explorer. As these and other analytics tools have become more advanced, it's become quite easy to see when something's not quite right. This just underscores the fact that DeFi protocols are not entirely analogous to TradFi products and services, which do not have this degree of transparency, and lie in their disclosures sometimes too. Now, the seventh recommendation is a lot more broad, and that's to enforce applicable laws on DeFi. Not much else to note, really, just that the authors tell regulators that DeFi protocols are purposely designed to evade regulations, so they'll have to be creative in how they crack down on them. Recommendation 8 is similarly redundant, and that's for regulators around the world to share the information they have about DeFi. That's because they need to make sure that no DeFi protocol escapes their grasp. They want to know where all those responsible persons are and how to get at them. Now, the ninth recommendation is a lot more interesting, and that's to examine the connections that DeFi has to the rest of crypto and to TradFi. The elephant in the former room is liquid-staked cryptos, mainly liquid-staked ETH. And in the latter room, it's stablecoins, mainly USDC. Newsflash, but liquid-staked tokens are extremely popular as collateral in DeFi. That's simply because you can earn an interest on the collateral you're borrowing against. Depending on interest rates and market conditions, this means that you can borrow for an indefinite period and not get liquidated. If you watched our video about stablecoin market caps, then you'll know that USDC is mostly used in DeFi. Another popular stablecoin in DeFi is DAI, which is decentralized on paper, but in practice is now significantly backed by US government debt, a regulatory touchpoint from IOSCO's perspective. It goes without saying that any issues with liquid-staked ETH, USDC, or DAI would have a Terra-level effect on crypto's DeFi ecosystem. Just a few more tail risks to keep in mind. So this brings me to the big question, and that's what all of this means for the crypto market. Well, the answer is threefold. First, it's likely to restrict the potential of DeFi and its tokens, which is one of the reasons we believe that it won't be one of the big narratives of the next crypto bull market, at least not initially. More about that in the description, by the way. Moving on. Now, the second impact these DeFi recommendations will have on the crypto market will be to make developers more nervous about building anything that could be construed as a financial product or service. The consequence of this is that we could see more non-financial use cases emerge in crypto. And this pertains to the third impact, and that's that these DeFi recommendations will force existing DeFi protocols to decentralize as much as possible. The silver lining in all of this is that securities regulators around the world seem to recognize that cracking down on DeFi is going to be very difficult. Although they may succeed in cracking down on some DeFi protocols, there are likely many that will survive the restrictions that are coming. Those that don't will likely be forked and revived, just like some people are trying to do with Tornado Cash. After all, crypto is open source. Everything can be rebuilt. Now, believe it or not, but these DeFi recommendations will likely benefit crypto in the long run once they become regulations. Besides increasing the decentralization of existing DeFi protocols, the explosion in non-financial use cases could set the stage for some serious mass adoption. If you're at all familiar with DeFi, you'll know that some of these protocols are truly cutting edge, with developers such as Yearn Finance's André Cronje being recognized industry-wide. Now imagine what will happen when these talented DeFi developers start to shift their focus to other products and services. It will inevitably result in killer dApps that will supercharge crypto's adoption overall, and this will increase the pressure on regulators around the world to pass more favorable crypto regulations. If you've been keeping up with our coverage of crypto regulations, you'll know this has been a key theme. Initially, crypto regulations are likely to be restrictive and damaging, but the even bigger byproduct will be more individual and institutional adoption. Over time, this adoption will reach a critical mass that's able to exert more influence over regulators than big banks and other financial incumbents can. And, come to think of it, the impending spot Bitcoin ETFs could be proof that this process has already begun. And that's all for today's video, folks, so if you learned something new, let us know by smashing that like button. If you want to keep learning, be sure to subscribe to the channel and ping that notification bell. If you want to help others learn, take a second to share this video with them. Whether you're planning on trading or hodling your DeFi tokens, the Coin Bureau Deals page has something for you. It's got trading fee discounts of up to 60% and bonuses of up to $40,000 on the best crypto exchanges, as well as the biggest discounts on the best hardware wallets. These deals are available for a limited time only, so take advantage of them ASAP using the link in the description. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Adios, crypto amigos.